Hello, everyone. I got our screencast here for the notes of the Montgomery bus boycott, which is about really goal 3 for this unit. And I've got goal 3 down underneath here. Students will be able to recognize methods to end discrimination and understand the different types of these methods. Some of them listed here are civil disobedience, boycott, litigation, protest march, or being a pioneer. The boycott, as it says in the title, is a boycott, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. The background to this, just to go back to what we've learned, remember in Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court way back in 1896 said separate can be equal as long as the facilities are equal. And in Brown v. Board in 1954, the court reversed itself, saying separate cannot be equal, that the moment you separate people based on race, you are creating feelings of inferiority that are about inequality. And then remember learning about Emmett Till and how the reaction of the people was shock and anger at his death, and how that mobilized people that weren't mobilized before. It led people to do things that hadn't done anything before. All those play a role in our notes today. The inspiration of the Montgomery bus boycott was Rosa Parks. There is no doubt. She had kind of started the bus boycott 100 days after Emmett Till's death. And she had heard someone come to her church the week before and spoke about the Emmett Till case, and that fired her up. It angered her a little bit and maybe made her want to take a little bit more direct action. She was a seamstress, but more importantly, she was an NAACP officer. She had worked for the NAACP for years in different capacities. She had actually served as someone who would counsel rape victims, African-American rape victims who had been specifically raped by white men, and encourage them to go public with their story and pursue charges against them. So as you might imagine, this is a very dangerous job for a young woman, African-American woman in the South to have, that by encouraging people to speak out, she was putting herself at risk. On that particular day, she was riding the bus home from work. She was sitting near the middle of the bus and was asked by a white passenger to move back, and actually by the bus driver to move back to the African-American section. She refused to do that, and she had said she was tired, not physically tired, but tired of it all, tired of the discrimination, tired of the racism and the segregation, and still angry about Emmett Till. She was arrested. She was convicted because she had broken a local law in Montgomery. The leader of the boycott is Martin Luther King Jr. He is a pastor at the Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He is only 26 years old at the time. We might have this image of King as a middle-aged man, but at this time he is very young. He is relatively new to the city, but he is charismatic. He's a great public speaker and seen even early on as a leader. Other people selected him to lead this. He at first refused, but then decided that he needed to be involved. 4 days later, he gave a famous speech to 15,000 people about how they might choose to protest segregation on Montgomery's buses and to follow up on what Rosa Parks had done by refusing to give up her seat. Here's part of that speech. There comes a time when people get tired of being trampled on by the iron feet of oppression. I want it to be known that we are going to work with bold and grim determination to gain justice on buses in this city. And we are not wrong. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. King is basically asserting the authority of the Supreme Court in their decision in Brown v. Board of Education to end segregation. He's referring to the religious belief that God created all people equally. He's referring to this idea of justice in America, that it should be blind and balanced. The boycott itself, well, a boycott is an act of voluntary and intentional abstention from using, meaning you stop using something, you stop buying something, or you stop dealing with a person, organization, or country as an expression of your protest, usually for social, political, or environmental reasons. This boycott is an abstention or refusal to use the bus system in Montgomery until it is desegregated. So African Americans chose to walk, they chose to ride bikes, they chose to carpool, they chose to take taxis, do anything they could except take those buses. How long did it last? Miraculously, it lasted 381 days. What did people do? Like I said, they carpooled, they walked, they rode bikes, they did whatever they could. During this time, King's home is firebombed. He and his children are not harmed, and his wife are not harmed. And the home of another leader of the boycott, Ralph Abernathy, is also bombed, but his family is not harmed. It would be a great story if I could tell you here that basically the bus company gave in. They did not. The white community rallied around the bus companies, gave them money to keep them afloat. Eventually, a federal judge ordered the desegregation of the buses in a 1956 ruling. Here's an image of King's firebombed home. King himself, as a result of this boycott, developed a strategy that he would come to call Soul Force. He took great ideas from influential thinkers and combined them into his strategy that he would use moving forward to fight in the civil rights movement. From Jesus, he borrowed the idea of loving thine enemy, kind of that turn your other cheek philosophy. From Henry David Thoreau, he borrowed the idea of civil disobedience, the refusal to comply with certain laws or to pay taxes and fines as a peaceful form of protest. Basically, the idea that if the law is wrong, a moral person has the right to disobey it. And if Jim Crow laws are wrong, then the moral action is to disobey those laws. He borrowed the ideas from A. Philip Randolph of how to organize movements and people. From Mohandas Gandhi, he borrowed the idea of Satyagraha, which means truth force. This is the idea of nonviolent resistance, where if you are passively resisting an action or law, and the person that's enforcing the law attacks you violently, your refusal to fight back will expose the truth about your enemy, showing them as immoral and you as moral. This idea that the person beating someone who is passive has to be the one in the wrong, and the person accepting the beating has to be the one in the right. Lastly, King said this famously: "We will wear you down with our capacity to suffer," meaning that Northern and Southern whites will tire of these beatings publicly. They will tire of the violence publicly, and they will give in to the demands of civil rights activists. Here's an example of a lunch counter sit-in where the person sits passively and then is attacked aggressively by the people that are against the protest, showing you who is in the right, showing you the truth about the enemy. Here's an example of a woman being dragged away by police with police dogs from a protest. Again, hard to look at this image and sympathize with the police, much easier to sympathize with the protester. Here's an example of a protester having dogs kind of sicked on him, for lack of a better term. And again, the idea you can't sympathize with the people with the dogs, you must sympathize with the protester. And lastly, young people being sprayed with a fire hose as a result of their protest. And again, hard to sympathize with those wielding the hose, much easier to sympathize with those that are suffering. Hopefully this makes sense. And again, if you have any questions, ask your teacher.